What is going on, everyone? I am your host, DylanLasagna, and welcome to Very Cold Lasagna. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to this on your favorite audio device, this show is your safe space for the most filthy casual takes on the world of pro wrestling and sports. Today, we got another good show for you all on episode number 107. We're going to be continuing our NFL season previews for 2022 as we go down south to the NFC South. That is right. It is part 3 of our 2022 NFL season previews. We've already covered 2 divisions, 8 teams. We've covered the NFC West and the NFC North. And I hope you guys have been enjoying our season previews so far. And I gotta be honest with you, there's been a couple of expectations on these teams. I've been a little hard on some, but it's for good reason. And I encourage you all to check them out. Check out my teams that I've covered so far already, whether it's on YouTube or on your favorite audio platform. So definitely go check them out. We are on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor FM, wherever you want to listen to Very Cold Lasagna. But now let's get into part 3 of our 2022 NFL season previews. Just like before, just in case you haven't seen the other 2 episodes covering our NFL season previews, pretty much what we'll be doing here is that we're just going to be discussing each team in every NFL division, 4 teams each, and pretty much my talking points for each team as we go along in our season previews is what they did in the season prior, what they did in the offseason that made them better or worse, my biggest takeaways from their offseason, and also what are some of their key strengths and weaknesses, and some questions that I have going into the regular season and potentially beyond. So, a little disclaimer already. Every preview is going to be subject to change because something might have happened before or after these episodes go up. Just like the one we're about to get into right here and now, because something did indeed go down right before I started this episode. So just keep that in mind. These previews may change like as soon as training camp begins or right before training camp starts or whenever. There are a lot of developments that can happen like when these previews are released or haven't been released yet. So just keep that in mind. So with that being said, let's get into our division that we're going to be covering today. We have 4 teams more to discuss: the Tampa Bay Bucs, the New Orleans Saints, the Carolina Panthers, and the Atlanta Falcons, aka the NFC South. So the very first team we're going to be talking about here in today's episode is none other than the team that finished last, who actually had a decent start to their 2021, and that is the Carolina Panthers. So for Carolina, yeah, they're in the news as of late, but we'll get there when we get there. So for Carolina, their 2021 was pretty poor. It was pretty piss poor because you get off to this 3-0 start with your new quarterback, Sam Darnold from the New York Jets. But Sam Darnold was okay. He was 50-50. He played good in the first game, and then when you get to the second and third game, he showed flashes of the old Sam Darnold from when he was with the New York Jets, but you still had a feisty defense that kind of saved his butt. So the Panthers get off to this 3-0 start, but then when you lose to the Dallas Cowboys, and then when you lose to the Philadelphia Eagles, because mainly, well, you pretty much got exposed that Sam Darnold's not the quarterback that Carolina signed him up for. And then you also have Christian McCaffrey, your supposed star running back, get injured again. And then you get injuries in the defense. And then Matt Rule pretty much screws up the quarterback position again when Sam Darnold gets hurt. He brings in Cam Newton, the washed quarterback from trying to revive the glory days of the 2015 Carolina Panthers, but clearly he's not the same quarterback that he once was, who was also released by the New England Patriots, and you sign him back into Carolina, and unfortunately, Cam Newton was a 1-week wonder. So the Panthers pretty much only win 2 games after their 3-0 start. They go 5-11, and people were questioning, people were wondering, was Matt Rule going to get fired? And unfortunately for Carolina fans, he was not. Matt Rule, despite all his micromanagement with the quarterback position and pretty much like the play calling, he was not fired. Who did get fired was their offensive coordinator in 2021, despite what Matt Rule was doing at the most important position of the game. So, tough luck, tough shit. Unfortunate stuff there, too, for the Carolina Panthers. So, very unfortunate there. So, when I did my season recap of the Carolina Panthers, my priorities for them was mainly about the quarterback position. Who was going to be the starting quarterback for 2022? Because they had no solid answer in 2021. Sam Darnold was well exposed to the fact that he's not going to be a starter. A change of scenery was not enough to prove that he can be a reliable starting quarterback. PJ Walker has been there for almost 2 to 3 years now, and he's not the guy. And then you brought in Cam Newton for half a season, and he was again a 1 week wonder. And then after that, against the Washington football team, he folded. So for Carolina, you had to figure out what your solution was going to be at the quarterback position, despite Matt Rule's reign of terror. Then you had to rehaul the offensive line because, in spite of all the crappiness at quarterback, your offensive line was one of the worst in the NFL. I'd say almost worse than the New York Jets offensive line before they started to come along and gel together late in the season for the Jets. Then you also had to re-sign corner Dante Jackson because aside from getting Stephon Gilmore early in the season, Dante Jackson was kind of a key part in the secondary. He was a very good corner for Carolina, an integral part of the secondary, netting turnovers for them. So he's one of those key pieces, especially considering the fact that they were going to be expected to lose Gilmore in free agency. So speaking of free agency, some of their moves that they made during the offseason was, they actually revamped the offensive lineup a little bit. So they committed to that. They got their center Bradley Bozeman from the Baltimore Ravens. And then they also got a guard in Austin Corbett from the LA Rams. So some key pieces to the offensive line, some solid pieces too. And then they got a new punter by the name of Johnny Hecker, somehow managing to get him to Carolina away from the Rams too. They also got a backup running back in Deontay Foreman. He's an okay backup piece in case Christian McCaffrey gets hurt again. And then on the defensive side, you did re-sign Dante Jackson to a contract extension. So they got that priority all figured out. And then you also got Xavier Woods, not the WWE's Xavier Woods, the free safety Xavier Woods from the Minnesota Vikings. And then they did manage to lose Hassan Reddick, a key part of their pass rush, to the Philadelphia Eagles, and as expected, Stephon Gilmore to the Indianapolis Colts. But that was well after the draft. Speaking after the draft, they managed to actually do pretty solid, despite not having that many picks. But the most important pick that they got was getting a lineman, a tackle by the name of Ikem Ikawunu from North Carolina State. And then surprisingly, they also got a quarterback from Ole Miss, Matt Corral. A little surprising there, but considering that the quarterback class was kind of weak and you had questions about Sam Darnold, can't knock him for it. But perhaps the biggest move that they made during the offseason was just very recently when they finally pulled the trigger. They finally had the little trigger on their finger, and that was getting the quarterback from the Cleveland Browns, yes, the skid marks, Baker Mayfield. They finally got Baker Mayfield after months of should we get him? Should we not get him? Should we go after Jimmy Garoppolo, or should we go after Baker Mayfield after we failed to get Deshaun Watson? They finally got their man in Baker Mayfield for pretty much a conditional 5th round pick in 2 years. It's a 2024 conditional 5th round pick. I don't know what those conditions are, but that remains to be seen. Now, Baker Mayfield has to pass a physical, and I don't know when that's going to happen, but he has to pass a physical in order for that trade to go through. So the Panthers actually did okay this offseason. They actually did focus on the offensive line, make that a commitment. So, like I said, with the moves with Bradley Bozeman and Corbett, so that offensive line as well. Oh yeah, as well as Ekuonu. So the offensive line looking, at least on paper, a little bit better than it was last year. So they won't be giving up as many. They seem like on track to not give up as many sacks as they were the previous year. So that's a start. But still, there remains questions about the pass rush because you lose Son Reddick, a key piece to your pass rush, and in your linebacking core. So you still have Shaq Thompson, but he and others are gonna have to step up to fill that void. But the most important takeaway from this for the Carolina Panthers in this offseason and going into the regular season is who's going to be the starting quarterback. You have Baker Mayfield, you have Sam Darnold, you have Matt Corral, you have PJ Walker, you have a bunch of people on the quarterback chart. Yeah, everyone's expecting that Baker Mayfield's just going to win the job outright. But apparently, they're going to have a quarterback competition all throughout training camp, all through preseason. And then they're going to decide who's going to be the starter come week 1. So we'll see what happens there. But honestly, Baker Mayfield is kind of a slight upgrade, but not that much of an upgrade over Sam Darnold. But hey, we'll see what happens there. So some key games for Carolina going into 2022. Obviously, if Baker Mayfield does end up being the starter by the start of the season, it's obviously going to be week 1 against the Cleveland Browns, especially considering that, well, it's against Baker Mayfield's old team, and you don't know who's going to be the starting quarterback for the Browns. It could be Deshaun Watson. It could be Jacoby Brissett. Hell, it could be some other dude signed off the street. So it could be a potential revenge game for Baker Mayfield in week 1, or maybe it couldn't. But then I think the most important slate for Cleveland is your 3-game homestand 2 weeks later from weeks 3 to 5 against the New Orleans Saints, the Arizona Cardinals, and the San Francisco 49ers. That's going to determine like where they stand in terms of like whether they're going to be competing or they're just going to be like fighting for a top draft pick or just be in a land of mediocrity in 2022. So that homestand against the Saints, the Cardinals, and the 49ers, it's going to be like one of those early indications of where they're going to stand in 2022. So for the Carolina Panthers, it's going to be, another one of those seasons where, like, sure, they upgraded at some parts of the team, like the offensive line, and sure, they got a nice quarterback in Baker Mayfield, at least on paper, but still got questions about the defense, especially in the pass rush and the secondary. Can J.C. Horn stay healthy? Who's going to be that leading man aside from Shaq Thompson? So for Carolina, I imagine their ceiling's going to be 7 wins at most. But if everyone gets injured again or everyone underperforms, Matt Rule like micromanages everything again, I imagine 5 wins again, another 5-win season, and perhaps Matt Rule finally gets fired by the end of the season. So we'll see with Carolina. I don't have many high hopes for them, but hey, if Baker Mayfield's the starter, who knows? And Matt Rule finally gets his head out of his own butt, stops getting in over his head. Who knows? Maybe the Panthers could be surprising, but I don't expect it. So the next team we're going to be talking about in the NFC South is the Atlanta Falcons. Now for the Falcons, it's one of those years. It's going to be one of those transitionary years. Or no, it's not even going to be a transitionary year. Why? We're going to get into it right now. For the Atlanta Falcons, it was kind of a weird year, 2021. You come up with one, on paper, one of the weirdest rosters that you have. A lot of players are on short-term contracts, and half of them are pretty old veteran players. And then midway through the season, you lose Calvin Ridley because he wants to focus on his mental health, and I can't blame him for that. And despite everything that's happening, you finished the season 7-10, and you were in contention for a playoff spot until you got beaten by the 49ers in week 15. But then again, you were only in that spot because you managed to beat some crappy teams at the last second, but then you got whooped when it mattered most by playoff contenders. So for the Atlanta Falcons, it was just one of those situations where it's like, okay, we didn't do pretty terribly, but at the same time, it's like we shouldn't have won this many games with a pretty mediocre roster. So it's like we kind of overachieved with said mediocre roster. So one of the biggest questions going into their offseason was, what do they do with Matt Ryan? Like, what do they do with them? Should they keep him on because he had a pretty big contract cap hit, or do they try to trade him? So that was one of the big questions going to the offseason. Another thing that should happen for the Falcons, as I mentioned in my season recap, was the emergence of Cordell Patterson in that offense, because I liked Cordell Patterson. I really liked him in that offense in Arthur Smith's offense. He was like a good receiver, and he was also like a good running back. So he basically did the Deebo Samuel role, but I think he was more durable with it. So that should have been the Falcons' one of the top priorities for the Falcons. And unfortunately, they also were pretty crappy on the defensive end, especially at the defensive line, because, well, they couldn't generate any pressures. They couldn't generate any sacks. So they needed some quality pieces on that defensive rush, especially when one of your key pieces, Dante Fowler, was going to be a free agent. Unfortunately, they didn't have that much money to spend, so it was going to be very difficult for them to address some of their key priorities in that offseason. So looking at some of their moves that they made during the offseason in free agency and the draft, they did manage to re-sign Cordell Patterson. So they get a key piece of him, a key piece of their offense back in the fold. They also signed running back Damian Williams from the Chicago Bears because they did lose Mike Davis to the Baltimore Ravens. They also added from the Las Vegas Raiders Casey Hayward, so a rotational piece for the secondary, and surprisingly Marcus Mariota from the Raiders. And why is that? Well, I'll get to that in just a bit. They also lost Russell Gage to the Tampa Bay Bucs, who was having a decent breakout late in the season. So he gets paid a little bit to go play for a division rival. Then you lose linebacker Fusaide Olukun to the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then you lose Dante Fowler, a key piece of your pass rush, to the Dallas Cowboys. And then perhaps one of the biggest moves for the Atlanta Falcons in the offseason was them trading Matt Ryan and his hefty contract to the Indianapolis Colts for a third-round pick in this year's draft. So, indication for the Falcons that it was just time for both sides to move on. They were just finally ready to move on, I guess. So that indication was growing larger when they signed Marcus Mariota, and then when they drafted the quarterback Desmond Ridder from Cincinnati in the third round. So I was kind of surprised that they Ridder fell a little bit further than I thought he would, but he's in Atlanta. They also managed to draft Jake London from University of Southern California. They also got linebacker Troy Anderson from Montana State and a guard Justin Sheffer from Georgia. So the Atlanta Falcons are clearly rebuilding. It's beginning this year, but unfortunately, they don't really have much like financial flexibility and much roster flexibility to do it. Like, it's pretty much the same situation as it was in 2021. You got a lot of like short-term like guys on the roster, but you also, at the same time, it's not as bad as it was in 2021 because you did manage to snag like a decent like wide receiver in Drake London, and you could have a potential solution at quarterback in Desmond Ridder. I mean, I think I've mentioned in my filthy casual preview of the NFL draft that Desmond Ridder looked the most NFL ready. It's just that he has like a tendency to get rid of the ball erratically. But if Arthur Smith develops him right, he could be like the Falcons' long-term answer at quarterback. Possibly, no. Unfortunately for the Falcons, they're going to be missing a key weapon in this offense. But even then, it was going to depend on like whether he wanted to come back to football or not. And that was Calvin Ridley, who got suspended in February for gambling, which was weird. So Calvin Ridley is suspended for the year for betting on Atlanta Falcons games. And that's going to have a impact on the offense. I mean, sure, you got Kyle Pitts, who had a really good year, despite the crappiness of the offensive line, despite the crappiness of the third string receivers. But Kyle Pitts had a really productive year in 2021. And who knows who's going to be the starting quarterback? Is it going to be Mariota or is it going to be Ritter? But expect a lot of Kyle Pitts and maybe a good amount of Drake London in that offense until 2023. And then the defense and the offensive line are probably going to be a bigger problem yet again in 2023 because they didn't really do much to adjust the defense. And the offensive line only got one addition with Justin Shafir, the guard. So, man, whoever's going to be a starting quarterback, they're going to have it rough. They're going to have it rough this year. So for Atlanta, some of their key games in 2022, it's the very first week in New Orleans. I mean, you want to at least give some Atlanta Falcons fans some kind of confidence that, well, we're playing our first game at home against our division rival in New Orleans, who may be facing some similar problems than us, like us. And we want to inspire some confidence that, okay, this rebuild is going to be okay. It's going to be all right. But then you get to weeks 2 to 3, you're on an NFC West road trip against the LA Rams and the Seattle Seahawks, who are also rebuilding. So it's like one of those like situations where you want to at least inspire some confidence. Maybe you could like upset the Seahawks, or you could probably steal a win in Seattle, but like you could try to fight hard against the LA Rams. But either way, it's just one of those situations where you have to at least inspire some confidence to your fan base that this rebuild's going to be fine. This is fine. You don't want, it's not like the meme where this is fine, everything is okay, and then there's a bunch of fire around you kind of situation for the Atlanta Falcons. So pretty much my only question going into the season for Atlanta is, well, who starts at quarterback? Mariota he's okay. I mean, he's okay, but unfortunately he hasn't been a starter in the league since he left the Tennessee Titans. And then you have a question about Desmond Ritter, but we'll see who wins the job in after training camp, after preseason, and then we'll go from there. But for the Falcons, unfortunately, there's just going to be like few other rebuilding teams in 2022. They're going to suck based on the talent that they have on defense. The offensive line is a mess. You don't have no Calvin Ridley. You're not sure of your quarterbacks. And that's going to result in what I'm predicting 3 to 5 wins. Yeah, you're going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. You're probably going to be competing with the Seahawks, the Bears, or maybe even the Panthers for the first overall pick in 2023. So for Atlanta, probably your top goal is to at least establish some confidence in both your fan base and your team itself that the rebuild is going to be just A-okay. And that starts in 2022. So now let's talk about the third team that almost made it to the playoffs, but was just so close, and fate did not fall on their side, and that is the New Orleans Saints. The good times, well, they didn't really roll that well in 2021, and now they're ushering in a completely new era in the Big Easy, which I think I mentioned this in my season recap. It might become the Big Hard. Yes, not as hard as my... you know what? Or there, you know what? I'm sorry. But anyway, it's a completely new era for New Orleans football. And why do I say that? Well, in 2021, the first half of it the first half of the new era of New Orleans football began because it was the first season without Drew Brees. 2021, Drew Brees, after they lost to the Bucs in the divisional playoffs, Drew Brees retired. He was on NBC doing his thing, and then here comes Jameis Winston as the successor to Drew Brees. Sean Payton was still there, and then they were actually doing pretty solid. You know, they were 3-2 going into their Week 8 matchup against Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Bucs at home in New Orleans, and Jameis Winston was honestly not that bad. He was pretty solid. He had his down games, of course. He still had those flashes of the 30 for 30 Jameis Winston back in 2019 and, of course, years prior and when he was in Tampa Bay. But other than that, he was pretty solid as the starter for New Orleans in 2021. Unfortunately, he tore his ACL in the second quarter of that game against the Bucs, but they still managed to upset the Tampa Bay Bucs in that game. But from there, it was just downhill. It was just literally downhill. A lot more players on the Saints just got injured. The offense significantly struggled with Trevor Siemian and Taysom Hill not being able to lead the offense that well. And even with their little experiment with Taysom Hill being the starting quarterback, it just did not work well. It just there was literally nothing going for them. And this was despite the still quality play from Cameron Jordan and Marshawn Lattimore in that defense. But unfortunately, it was just too much to overcome. Now, they did have an opportunity to clinch a playoff spot on the very last day of the regular season. All they needed was some help, but unfortunately, they did not get it because, well, the Rams let that slip away to my 49ers. And the Saints just simply didn't have enough. Even if they did manage to make the playoffs, they would have gotten their asses whooped. They simply would have gotten their asses whooped simply because, well, they just didn't have enough weapons. They didn't have the quarterback that could lead them to an upset over, who knows, a Dallas or a Tampa Bay or the LA Rams. Just simply not the quarterback, whether it's Trevor Siemian or Taysom Hill, that could lead them to an upset in the first round. So they end their season 9-8. It was pretty much injury riddled all around in that second half of the season. Now, of course, your top goal for 2022 was to assure everyone stays healthy and very much give yourself a fighting chance against the Tampa Bay Bucs in the NFC South because, well, pretty much of everything that's happening in that division. Some of your offseason priorities for the New Orleans Saints from my season recaps was, well, they had to get under the salary cap because I think they were over $50 million. They were negative $50 million before free agency began, and then somehow, some way, they managed to get under that number. They also had to re-sign Jameis Winston because, well, you already knew what Taysom Hill was, and, well, he managed to get a ridiculous contract extension in the middle of the season in 2021, and that was pretty much one of my priorities. You had to restructure his ridiculous contract. But anyway, one of your main priorities was to get Jameis Winston back, and hopefully he recovers fully from his ACL injury. And then you had to address the wide receiver position because, well, it was not good in 2021. You pretty much had no weapons in that year, and Michael Thomas was just not able to play for you at all. So some of the key moves that they made in the offseason, starting with free agency, well, they did manage to re-sign Jameis Winston to a 2-year deal, a team-friendly deal. So Jameis Winston got that team-friendly bag. They also signed Traquan Smith, the wide receiver that was mediocre. They made some key moves on the defensive end. They signed 2 players from the Kansas City Chiefs. Tyrann Mathieu returning home, and well, in New Orleans at least, that's his place that he grew up in, and strong safety Daniel Sorensen, both from the Kansas City Chiefs. They also got a backup safety in Marcus May from the New York Jets, and then of course they got a backup quarterback by the name of Andy Dalton. Yes, the Red Rifle from the Dallas Cowboys. So, oh no, he played for the Chicago Bears in 2021. See? Dallas Cowboys, Bears football. You can't get enough of the Red Rifle in the NFL. You did lose some key pieces in 2021 during your offseason. And the most important one was Sean Payton, your head coach. 2 weeks after the season ended, he stepped down as head coach. I forgot the reasons why, but he was pretty much just drained. I guess from the look of it, he just looked drained. He just probably didn't want to take a part in the rebuild. But either way, at least Sean Payton did get a Super Bowl. But unfortunately, he just simply couldn't lead his team back to another one with Drew Brees. But Sean Payton, it's a big loss for New Orleans. Dennis Allen is your new head coach for the Saints. And unfortunately, he hasn't exactly had the best track record when it comes to being a head coach, especially when it comes to his time with the then Oakland Raiders, where he had an 8-28 record in his 2 years there. You also lost a key piece of your offensive line, Teron Armstead to the Miami Dolphins, and Marcus Williams, the free safety, to the Baltimore Ravens. But they managed to rectify some of that in the draft by getting Ohio State wide receiver Chris Olave, just in case in the event Michael Thomas can't play. Northern Iowa offensive tackle Trevor Penning, solid tackle by the way. And they also got a corner by the name of Alontae Taylor from Tennessee. So these were actually solid picks in the NFL draft. So the Saints pretty much had a good draft to counter the key losses that they had in free agency. I mean, unfortunately, they can't rectify the one with their head coach, but when it comes to their playing roster, actually a pretty decent draft to counter their losses. Now, whether Dennis Allen can use that very solid roster that's still there, it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. How does his tenure from the Raiders and his time since then as a coordinator, how does he learn from that experience? How does he transition his experiences to another head coaching opportunity coming this fall? That remains to be seen. Now, Taysom Hill, continuing that topic, he's no longer going to be a quarterback. He's not apparently not going to be on the quarterback chart this coming season because Dennis Allen has moved him to tight end. Yes, he's pretty much going back to that utility player, but it's going to be more committed to the tight end spot, which is pretty weird. So they also are going to make sure that in the event that Michael Thomas can't play, Chris Olave is going to be the top receiver. So they gotta make sure that he pans out. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with Chris Olave. But I think he's a good pickup for New Orleans. He can as long as he builds chemistry with Jameis Winston or whoever's going to be the starter. He can pretty much be that number one or number two option in that offense. Now, some of their key games in 2022, it's pretty much the first 3 weeks. You're in Atlanta. You're going home to play Tampa Bay in your home opener. And then you go to Carolina. Pretty much your first 3 weeks are within the division. So that's interesting. That's pretty interesting scheduling right there. So that's going to determine what your place is going to be when it comes to competing for an NFC South title. Now, Atlanta and Carolina, they're pretty beatable as long as the defense for New Orleans, they hold up and the offense just has to take care of their part. For Tampa Bay, well, I mean, New Orleans has pretty much they've pretty much been Tom Brady's kryptonite for the last 2 years, at least in the regular season. But, it's a new season. Who knows if things can change or they stay the same. Then you go to, you host the Las Vegas Raiders week 8, Derek Carr and Devontae Adams, Hunter Renfrow, that electrifying offense. Can that Saints defense hold them down? That's going to be a big game in the midway point of the season. Then you go to week 12. Everything will depend on where both teams are in San Francisco against the 49ers. But if they're both in position for a playoff spot, that could be a crucial game. That could be a crucial game for both teams, like tiebreakers, seeding. It could be a crucial game for either team. Now, some of the big questions for New Orleans is like, how's Michael Thomas? How is he after a year, almost a year and a half or two, having not played a single game in the NFL? Like, how is he gonna look? Like, is he really fully healthy to play again? Like in the NFL? Because we've heard so many times that he's recovering well, and then he has a setback. So the Saints are hoping that he's finally fully healthy after almost a year, actually a full year of not being healthy to play. So because they badly need him. They badly need them in case Chris Olave doesn't pan out. Now, can James Winston build off the modest success that he had in 2021? He can, but will he? That remains to be seen. Now, I do consider the Saints a sneaky wildcard team, but all depends on Dennis Allen and how he coaches his team. Jameis Winston, and if he can be more than a modest quarterback than he was in 2021 before he went down with the ACL tear. How the offense around him supports him, and how much how far the defense can carry him like they did last year. So the Saints can be one of those sneaky wildcard teams, but they can also be a team that misses out and have a losing record of 8-9. So for the Saints, they're not that out of the the playoff race, but they're also not a total rebuilding team, like the team that's close to rebuilding. But, we just have to keep our expectations a little low for New Orleans, because they have a solid roster to work with. But it's going to be on Dennis Allen to take them to the next level, or to a level in 2022 to compete with the Tampa Bay Bucs. So the final team that we're going to be talking about in this NFC South season preview is none other than, the team that won the division in 2021 relatively easily, and that is, of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, or as I like to call them, the Tampa Bay Bucs by short. Now, it's an interesting season for them, and it could have been like an even worse one for them had an interesting decision not happened. But we'll get there when we get there. So for the Tampa Bay Bucs, they were pretty close to going back to the Super Bowl, going back to repeating as Super Bowl champions. But in 2021, they pretty much cruised to the NFC South division title and the NFC second seed, just short of the Green Bay Packers. But late in the season, there were some weird things that were going on. Key players like Chris Godwin, Tristan Wirfs, the receiver Godwin, offensive tackle Tristan Wirfs, Leonard Fournette, the running back, Ronald Jones, another running back, and others were either missing time, or in the case of Chris Godwin, would miss the rest of the season due to injuries. So late in the season, sure, they managed to win a couple of games, but those injuries were starting to pile up. And then, of course, you have the situation with Antonio Brown acting like a goofball during the New York Jets game, and he gets released. So they were losing some key pieces in that offense, and also there were other key injuries on the defensive side of the ball. So in the playoffs, sure, you cruise relatively easily against the Philadelphia Eagles. You whip their ass in the first round. But then Tristan Wirfs goes down with a concussion, and he can't play in the divisional game against the LA Rams, and his loss pretty much proves to be costly. But even then, even with the loss of Tristan Wirfs in the offensive line, the secondary was getting torched like hell against Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp. And sure, they pulled off the comeback. They tied the game, but they couldn't stop Cooper Kupp in a clutch reception. So the Bucs lose the game on a field goal. Their bid to repeat pretty much ended on a last-second field goal in that divisional game against the eventual new champions, the LA Rams. So for 2022, their goal was pretty much for them to get back to the Super Bowl, get past the NFC, and get Tom Brady one more ring before he potentially retires. That's the funny thing. That was the funny thing. Yeah, about that, Tom Brady did retire after the season. Tom Brady did retire. And then another funny thing happened. Tom Brady decided 1 month later that's like, no, fuck it. I'm not ready for the dad life. I'm not ready to be with my kids full time. Not ready to be a full time dad. So yeah, I'm going to go unretire and play another season of football. So pretty much Tom Brady was like on a 1 month retirement tour. And he was like, nope, I'm not doing this. I'm gonna play till I'm pretty much dead. So that's Tom Brady for you, and he's back for another season of Tampa Bay Bucs football. So that's pretty much your goal for 2022. Get Tom Brady to yet another Super Bowl and win it before he decides to retire for real. Now, some of the key things that the Bucs did in free agency in the draft to support Brady and his unretirement, well, they managed to get Ryan Jensen back, their center. They also got Leonard Fournette back. And they also re-signed defensive end William Golston. So 3 key pieces to their Super Bowl team from 2020, all back. They also added a couple of key pieces like Russell Gage from the Atlanta Falcons, receiver, defensive end Akeem Hicks from the Chicago Bears, solid defensive end, just poorly utilized by Bears football. Cornerback Logan Ryan from the New York Giants. And then in a trade with the New England Patriots, which I don't understand why they did it, but they got guard Shaq Mason, so Tom Brady's old teammate, for the Bucs 2022 5th round pick. Unfortunately, they did lose a couple of key pieces as well. Head coach Bruce Arians also retired, for real though, but he's still with the organization as a senior football consultant. So he chose defensive coordinator Todd Bowles as the new head coach. So a little bit of familiarity, some in-house stuff. Tight end Rob Gronkowski, Brady's longtime teammate, also retired for the second time. So I guess him getting slimed with Miranda Cosgrove, or maybe he wants to go back to WWE and do all the crazy 24/7 title stuff. Only this time he won't get scared. So I guess it was the sliming he had at the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards with Miranda Cosgrove. Finally convinced him to retire again. So for Gronk, yes, he's retired a second time. And it looks like it's for real this time. But who knows? Gronk always changes his mind. Tackle Ali Marpet also retired. So they lost 2 key pieces to the offensive line. And that second piece is guard Alex Kappa, who went to the Cincinnati Bengals. Ronald Jones got pushed out by Leonard Fournette to the Kansas City Chiefs. And Bradley Pinion, the punter, who had a resurgent career with Tampa Bay, to the Atlanta Falcons. So you bring in Russell Gage to the from the Atlanta Falcons, and now Bradley Pinion goes to the Atlanta Falcons. So a 1-for-1. So in the draft, the Tampa Bay Bucs drafted defensive tackle Logan Hall from Houston. They also addressed the offensive line by adding offensive tackle Luke Goedeke from Central Michigan. And they got a backup running back by the name of Rashad White from Arizona State, just in case Leonard Fournette goes down. And a tight end by the name of Cade Otton from Washington. So a tight end to compete with Cameron Brate. So for the Bucs, sure, you have a golden opportunity to win the NFC, especially considering how weak it is. But there were a couple of key losses, especially on the offensive line, and especially at the tight end spot, where you kind of question, how far can they go? Even with Tom Brady, sure, he's considered the best quarterback of all time. I mean, sure, there's no denying that. But there are some holes. There's still kind of some a few holes that can prevent them from going back. So the Bucs, there are a lot of weird things that happened, and there are also a couple of losses that could potentially stop them from returning to the Super Bowl. And one of those things could be the backup running back spot. It could be a serious issue if Leonard Fournette gets injured again. You don't know what you have in Rachaad White, and Keyshawn Vaughn was okay, but he wasn't that great in in the inside. So you have some concerns at the running back spot going into this season. And then the offensive line, you lost Ali Marpet, Alex Kappa, two key pieces. So you have to address those spots in the offensive line before the season starts. Otherwise, it's just going to be a whole mess like it was in the divisional playoffs against the Rams. So for the Bucs, sure, you still got your talented offense with Tom Brady, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Leonard Fournette, and you got a defense that's still pretty loaded. But you still have those questions. Around the whole team. Looking at some of the key games of 2022, it's the first 2 weeks. You're on the road the first 2 weeks against the Dallas Cowboys and the New Orleans Saints. New Orleans has pretty much beaten your ass like 4 straight times. Like heaven knows how. Despite like what has gone on in the Big Easy in the last couple of years. And then you finally return home to a pretty difficult homestand. You face the Green Bay Packers and Aaron Rodgers, and then you go on Sunday night to face Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. Rough first month. Sure, Dallas, you can like brush them off, but you never know with Dak Prescott. And then New Orleans, well, they swept you for 2 straight seasons. Aaron Rodgers is Aaron Rodgers, and Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes. Then a couple weeks later, week 8 to 9, you're facing Lamar Jackson for the first time ever. And then you have to face the LA Rams in a divisional playoff rematch, both at home, by the way. And then, of course, I only put this here for shits and giggles. Tom Brady, it's always fun when he has a homecoming in his home state. He goes to San Francisco again to take on the 49ers and the young slinger, Trey Lance. So a lot of key games for the Tampa Bay Bucs in 2022, especially in the first month of the season. So for the Bucs, like there are a lot of questions about this team, like the offensive line, how much Akeem Hicks can bolster the holes that are still kind of missing in that Bucs pass rush, and the tight end spot now that Gronk has retired, and whether or not Cameron Brate or Cade Otton or anyone that's in that tight end depth, like who can be that starter that Tom Brady can trust at that tight end position. So some questions for the Tampa Bay Bucs and Todd Bowles this season, but they're still going to win this division. They're still going to win this division because they still have Tom Brady as their quarterback coming back. And if he doesn't, granted he doesn't fall off the cliff yet, they're going to win the division. They're probably going to win 12 games max, maybe even more than that, and be competing for the top seed in the NFC. So for the Bucs, like don't panic yet. Like their fan base, their team shouldn't be panicking yet. But who knows? Maybe those concerns could impact them in the long run. But for now, consider the Bucs. They're in the NFC South. It's pretty much the Bucs division to lose. So that was part 3 of our 2022 NFL season previews. That was the NFC South. And just like with the NFC North, it's pretty much a one team division. Now, granted, as long as the Bucs take care of their business, they'll be fine. Like they should be okay with Tom Brady. There's questions about New Orleans, and definitely Carolina and Atlanta are not competing with either one of those teams. So if there are serious things that are going on in Tampa Bay throughout the 2022 season, it's their division to lose. It's honestly their division to lose. So what do you guys think about the NFC South in 2022? Who's going to win that division? Is it Tampa Bay's by default? What's going to happen with Tom Brady? What's going to happen with Jameis Winston? What's going to happen with the Atlanta Falcons and the Carolina Panthers? Let me know. Let me know your weird takes. Let me know your opinions on these 4 teams, how they're going to do in 2022, however you can. So 3 divisions down, 5 to go. We're getting there. We're pushing through. Next time we do the season previews, we're going to be finishing up the NFC by talking about the NFC East. Yes, the NFC East, baby. And, man, it's going to be a downright shame to talk about all 4 of these teams because they suck. They suck. But anyway, that is it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna, episode number 107 of the Very Filthy Casual Sports Fan Podcast. I'm your host, DylanLasagna. Thank you for tuning into this fine episode. Make sure you tune into the podcast wherever you can, whether it's YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor FM, and Google Podcasts. Follow the show on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at Very Cold Lasagna. And as always, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of pro wrestling and sports. And until next time, peace out.